Welcome back, folks, to episode 101 of the Running Man Self-Regulation Skills Project podcast with me, your host, Dr. Armando Dominguez, PhD in health psychology, licensed professional counselor, and an adjunct professor at a local community college. And what we're going to be discussing today is going to be about character, heroes, villains, and am I a caricature of myself is the question we'll be answering based on those things that shape us into the personalities that we see and experience as an individual, but also get into what character is as far as traits, as a constellation of traits that we recognize in a person and in ourselves, and how those are shaped and what might be the result of environmental pressure that calls us to become who it is that we become. To kick off this discussion this early Sunday afternoon, nice and sunny here in West Texas, I'm going to start with an idea. The historian Will Durant supposedly spent about 40 years studying the history of the world, and the book, The Story of Civilization, was what he came out with. But some of the things that he concluded once we look at the summary of this whole study of his was the fact that we, as human beings, are shaped to a greater or lesser extent by demanding situations. We become greater by the demand that our situations, one, but also our environments put on us that shape us into the people that we essentially as an outcome embody or characterize, so to speak. We want to look at it as an, in quotes, role. Strangely, this might be uncomfortable to hear for some that wrestle with the ideals regarding being shaped by environment, meaning nature versus nurture. And this is the nurture, meaning the outside forces shape what it is that we become. Because by necessity, we have a comfort level one direction or another based on how we're brought up. The fact of the matter is it's really a very nuanced balancer that shapes us. But it's still not easy to hear, especially whenever we, as individuals, we tend to watch TV and movies, and we tend to highlight the talents and the extreme charisma and giftedness of our heroes and wonder whether or not, was that taught? Can I become that? Or is it something that's endogenous, hiding somewhere within my genetic code that I just need to press just right, and then all of a sudden I start becoming or growing in those directions that I esteem and want to become like, especially like a hero, like in Star Wars, the Jedi and the Mandalorians, ethic in the movie that just recently came out, and becoming quite the hero, and also having this ethic that oversees the development of how the character becomes who it is that he becomes throughout the challenge. And we like the idea of the hero's journey. And I personally do, and that is something I lean towards, being a martial artist and training for protection of self and others. And there is definitely a moral and ethic involved with that. But whenever we're seeking to overcome those things that would be stresses or circumstances in our lives, we have to wonder what is it that drives the desire to become those things. If we were, for instance, bullied or traumatized, and yes, I am taking the average to the extreme circumstances here, those shape us, and they will determine how it is that we develop, one, what we call our character. And the character is, once again, the constellation of traits that are very consistent that we can recognize and say, yes, this is so-and-so, happy-go-lucky, stressed and anxious person, this sort of thing. And those are just examples, not derogating either, but just making a point a little finer for this discussion. But we tend to look at, even within the confines of this discussion, the possibility of free will. And I know that I love to read Dr. Sapolsky's work and also listen to him lecture, but he very distinctly says, and he is very, very granular to the point of the cellular structures driving those things that we do not consciously control. I'm in agreement with that, such that, everything that is a result at the very end, at the outcome level, our behavior, our physical, measurable, someone else can see us doing this behavior, is a result of everything it drives from the microcellular to the macro structural and the skeletal structural and brain behavior type stuff, and that somehow we're not involved consciously. We're just along for the ride, so to speak. And not so much reflective of the ghost of the machine, in the machine, rather like Descartes and his error thinking that, somehow we're separate, but still reflective of self-awareness and a sensorium that we do have some control over, conscious control, like blink rate. We can change that even though it's autonomic and breathing as well. But also even with practice, changing our body temperature and this sort of thing. And that starts getting into supernormal to superhuman capacities. And there are those things. But when we're looking at becoming the hero, those ideas, they tend to be very reflective of who it is that we aspire to be, or who it is that we were basically shunted and directed into becoming, depending on the pressure of our environment external, and also the models that we emulated vicariously, and also those pressures internally, our general genetic inheritance, and how they made us feel as we went along, or how capable we were of learning and emulating, for instance, behaviors. So these are some forces to keep in line whenever we're thinking about the idea of hero, villain, and that characteristic, in quotes, that I just mentioned earlier, the caricature of myself. That isn't meant to be a derogation in term, or a lessening of an individual or my judgment of people that struggle. Not at all. This is, if anything, just a narrative, a story told to get the point across a little better, and to make a very distinct example of those things that are differences that we have to note, that aren't always so easily seen as I'm going to separate them. They're a little more subtle, and there's always interplay, and there's always going to be a little bleed through from one categorization to the next. Things are rarely perfect, and if they are, they're absolute, and I don't believe that absolute exists in the truest sense, but variations and gradations of things that fall within spaces that look rather solid and continuous. And we tend to fall into the illusion of believing the absolute. I've done that, and I'm certainly learning how to grow out of that. So here's the next part. What Durant was also talking about is really important here. He was actually arguing against what Carlyle said about the human condition, and in quotes, I'm reading this from a book in particular, and it says, I think Carlyle was wrong. And Durant's response was, in quotes, the hero is a product of a situation rather than the result being a product of the hero. That means the hero doesn't precede the action in all cases. And this is arguable because you can do heroic things after you've achieved that heroism, or that state, so to speak, or trait, more likely, if that is a character. Now, something that's continuous and doesn't just come and go like we breathe, but rather it is demand that brings out the exceptional qualities of man, in quotes, heroes. From the function of meeting a situation which demands all his potential abilities, I think the ability of the average man, or woman for this matter, could be doubled if it were demanded, if the situation demanded. This also kind of tells us, wow, how amazing the human body, and that it's amazing what we can get used to. And this isn't always a positive descriptor of what we're able to get used to, because the ability to survive something that's particularly traumatic and not thrive necessarily, but you're making it, you're living through it, you're somehow getting there, and some would say that's mere existence. I would say it's not at that level necessarily, but it certainly can be pretty darn close. What is just a matter of breathing and eating. And there have been those that we hear and read about that have made it through horrendous things. And the important thing here is to recognize that we're moving into the area of character. Once again, the constellation of traits that we would call myself or someone else that I know, but not necessarily saying that those traits are them. That is not their individual whole magnitude of their valuable selves, but rather those are the behaviors that I note, that I would say are constants that I see when I interact with this person. So the character of myself would be those things that are most stable: behaviors, emotions, responses, and reactions. Now, we talked about the heroes and the villains, and if Durant's ideas hold true, that means that the demands put on us may shape how it is we respond, especially if we're continuously, chronically in situations that are stressful, uncomfortable, painful, frightening. And what about if they're generative? What if they're in enriched environments where we see kiddos that become rather masterful at, let's say, piano playing, gymnastics, playing cello, or mathematics, those things that are enriched, and if they just happen to have the proclivity, that propensity to develop and learn those things, then boom, we have gas and we've got fire and we're cooking now. And that's a powerful combination. We don't always know what it is. And as a parent and in parenting, generally speaking, we want our offspring to do well and at the very least better than what we have done, moving them forward. And we want them to survive into adulthood, of course. But at the same time, we want them to do well. We want to see them do well. And in a very interesting sense, parents want to vicariously live through their kiddos, not to the point where they don't live their own lives. That would be unhealthy, but in a sense that they enjoy some of that glorified work that they've done, to where they are enjoying what they do and they're enjoying success. Those are okay things to have. It's healthy, just as long as it doesn't squash the child or the individual to where they feel like they're living for their parents instead. That's not okay. But the reason I'm mentioning this is that these are the type of things that we have mentors. We have a great model, a parents, uncles, teachers. Sometimes we hear of kiddos going back and saying thanks after they've achieved their success and saying, this person put me on the path, or they gave me the right model, example, and encouragement. Those important things. Now, what about the hero and the villain? We can say, and this isn't right as in morally right, but rather just the correct amount or just the needed amount to set somebody in motion in the direction of heroism or villainy. Well, those would be what we would call a match made, not necessarily in heaven, but in opportunity. And often there are those that will capitalize on that. Some find strength in walking in those ways. Some have to become strong. Some have to become dangerous to be able to survive in situations. And there are many that their minds are changed because they were involved in very negative things at a very young age, that it's hard for them to interact socially without stressing, or if they stress in a regular social situation that is low intensity, that is non-threatening in the sense that their body feels dangerous, but if it's, for instance, odd or uncomfortable because it's new and the unknown, then stressors can come up as if it's a threat, depending on how quick it is and whatever emotional load is there. And prior training, prior experiences, prior conditioning can actually create a very uncomfortable situation. Even if you're going to visit somebody and go to a birthday party, many people might be there. That might be the crowds that make people uncomfortable, maybe the noise. It may be thinking about, I'm going to see somebody I don't like, or that's somebody that made me mad, and I feel that sense of I can't control myself. Mind you, this podcast is called Self-Regulation Skills Project. Often we feel that inability to self-regulate it, or that fear of I can't self-regulate my feelings or my behaviors, because sometimes we believe what it is we're thinking, and what we think tends to be hyperbolic often, because that's an exaggeration that wants to encourage our body, or rather it's made to encourage our body to over-respond to make sure that we make it this time and that we don't get hurt or get taken advantage of, so therefore we come in guns a-blazing, so to speak. Now, when it comes to social situations that aren't dangerous but yet they're new, or social situations where one starts feeling anxious, and often with this anxiety we have that sense of self-judgment, that sense of I feel dumb, that sense of insecurity. Oh, I don't know, I'm not smart enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not good looking enough, I'm not big enough, not wealthy enough, or I don't know enough, or I'm going to stumble on my words, I'm going to look like a fool. Notice that everything that I'm repeating is very ego-oriented, very I-oriented, but it's also tied to stress that is very self-protection oriented. The last two podcasts, episode 99 and 100, talked about the 4 F's, and we spoke about procrastination and hesitation, and also how they're reflective of the drives of survival. And when we start talking about this narrative, I'm in a stressful situation, even though it's not threatening to me physically, but I respond to it as if it's threatening. What's it threatening? If your body is technically safe, Nobody's trying to harm you. You're feeling like the bologna sandwich, and you believe yourself to be the bologna sandwich, and you start thinking you're tasty, and everything out there looks like a tiger that's ready to eat me. Then I'm going to feel very vulnerable, very uncomfortable, to say the least. But also, I may be more apt to make mistakes. I may be more jittery, and I start saying things like, and this is in quotes, things that I've actually heard clinically and also out and about with people. I don't like being in crowds. I don't like going to parties. There's too many things happening. Things are too fast. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't want to see people I don't like. Then I start feeling like the walls are closing around me. I start getting fidgety or twitchy, and I start looking sketchy and nervous. And people know everyone's looking at me, even though often we hear people don't care. Nobody cares what you're doing. And what if there is somebody that is looking at you? Whoa, that just made it worse. Just by chance, somebody did look at you. Oh, they're looking at me. Everyone's looking at me. And it becomes an exaggeration to an absolute level of everybody, everything, all the time, everyone. And I never do well in these situations. I can never improve myself. I'm always like this. I'm never like that. And the adjudications and the insecurities get exaggerated. Once again, it becomes a survival level event as far as the feel of it, even though it's not a dangerous event to you, other than if you have some sort of medical condition that you're trying to grind through and you're white knuckling through it because you're now caught in a catch-22, that social situation level stuff, not threatening to your body, but rather threatening to your ego, wherever you're just grinding through it and eating it and not saying anything, and you're sweating and you're feeling your heart rate going up, your breathing changing, anxiety and physical muscular tension. It is a terribly uncomfortable space to be, based on what we believe things to be like, even though they may not be that way. And we tend to believe what we think very quickly, and we tend to in the visual mind, visualize what it is that is expected, and we tend to paint a picture, a narrative that's not true about a future that hasn't happened, that I very much could shape to a degree as to how I respond or whether or not I respond. And that's very pressuresome. Now, why is this really important? If somebody is in a situation that is very dangerous to them, such as an abusive situation, growing up in an abusive or alcoholic home, or drug-laden home for that matter, where if a parent were inconsistent, maybe violent, and not only that, could be happy one day and sad the next, or even painful or angry at you as a little one, then all you can do is try to do those things that encourage them to give you what you need: food, water, shelter, no hitting, no hurting, this sort of stuff. And making sure that you get what you want may include putting on a false role, put on the mask, not of the marketplace, but of the survival in the home. And this is what we start seeing disordered personality traits occurring over time. Wherever somebody shows up, and then all of a sudden it's like somebody flips a switch and the role is on. It's like they put on the mask. They're one moment like this, and the next moment they're like, who are you? This is different. Or you become the life of the party. You become the clown. You become the party favor. You start becoming the hero. You're the one that's going to be the black sheep of the family. And we start taking on these behaviors and say things where it seems like a sub-personality when the behaviors come up, where we start acting in a way that's scripted almost. And this is where Sapolsky's work really comes in, where it looks like we don't have free will, and that we're subject to the reactivity to our environment that is beyond our conscious control. And I agree to a degree, but not absolutely 100%, because that can be changed. We can choose differently in a situation. It's harder whenever the amygdala and the limbic regions, the emotional areas of our body, start taking off based on historical discomfort, just because it's similar or may sound like something I've experienced before. We tend to respond like it's happening again, just to make sure it doesn't happen again, especially if it was painful. So whenever we start responding this way, this is what we start seeing: personality traits that aren't necessarily traits in the truest sense of character, but rather they're part of a smaller constellation of sub-character that we call our disordered personality behaviors and speak and thought patterns that tend to go together, and they tend to resemble like a constellation of human, subhuman, and also it can be misinterpreted as multiple personality disorder. It's not that. That is something that's so exceedingly rare that there's really no point in talking about that. But fact of the matter, many people think that they have different personalities because their reactions to the environment is so severe and so intense that it's so real. They can feel it in their body. It must be real, even though maybe there's no fact as to what's driving that, but rather the factual aspect is that they're actually reacting as if it's a life-threatening event versus it being an actual event. They're treating it like it is based on belief. And it's not a dumb, I'm just believing this because it looks this way, but rather the body's responding that way, and it precedes our highest level of reasoning at the prefrontal cortical that comes on at about 1.2 seconds. That's 400 times slower than the amygdala and limbic regions that are firing off autonomically. And this is pre-conscious before it ever splits off and becomes conscious. By the time it gets to the conscious mind, we're already off to the races, so to speak. Heart rate, body shift, and also hormones and endocrines firing off the way they need to for survival situations that may not be occurring. I've seen many people that in very short order quickly become aggressive and angry and anxious and start yelling as if somebody said something wrong to them. And what they're really expressing is their discomfort at the unknown or to something they don't understand. They don't want to look dumb, so instead they look angry like somebody did something wrong, and they blame offense and point fingers at someone else as if somebody offended them intentionally, when in actuality it was their own discomfort. And the discomfort with what? Those things that are unknown. People treating each other respectfully or safely, and they interpreting only after the fact that we find out that they were saying that they were acting fake and they were being inauthentic and they were lying. They're all liars. Mind you, I said all as an absolute. And we've spoken about this in the Running Man Model episode 1. Of course, that's a really ugly episode because I have my podcast voice now, but still the information is quite useful. I have a couple of videos on YouTube that kind of point this out. But whenever the blood flow leaves the front part of the brain that carries sugar, the requisite sugar required to be able to do thinking, then that means the blood is going to the rest of the body. Now, the lower levels of brain do keep their blood because they need to be able to function, to be able to do the autonomic type stuff. But when it comes to making higher reasoning make sense and categorizing, labeling, and naming, we don't need to do that because we should be running, fighting, or fleeing. We're in the realm of the 4 F's of survival. Actually, the multi-F's that we talked about in episode 99, but you understand. But also these behaviors are reflective of those drives, and they're basically not only reflective, but actually projections of those drives into what we call the behaviors and the speaking and the belief systems that we develop as a result on the fly based on those levels of stress that we experience. So what is the caricature of myself? The caricature of myself is not a full character, but rather, I don't want to say comical, but I would say fanciful, and I would say something that is not an accurate representation, but rather maybe even an exaggeration or a minimization of what it is and who it is that I consider myself to be. If we were to look at Superman versus a man, Superman would be a caricature because we know that people don't have those kind of superpowers flying around at will. But we do know that there is humanity within the Superman character as he's written, and that is not an exaggeration because there's kindness and service to mankind and very altruistic in that sense. But the caricature is that we put out often, those roles that we play that seem exaggerated, that seem over the top, that seem not only charismatic, but actually quite hooking of our attention because like, wow, that's neat. Whenever we see somebody on television or these stars that are being interviewed, we tend to tie into all those charismatic traits and talents and the good looks and the makeup. And those are characterizations of something that they aren't. If you see them without all the adornment, they seem rather human, and they really are. But whenever we put up or show up more correctly, these adornments that we call our character to deal with something that's uncomfortable, then we are dealing with a inauthentic presentation. I'm not arriving, but rather my mask or my role is what I'm arriving at. So here I am playing at Shakespeare just to live, to survive, and to entertain, to get the things that I need, that sense of acceptance. We were wired to the group when we were cave people. If you didn't have it, you'd be hunted down and eaten very quickly. Nobody to watch your six, and you wouldn't be part of a higher group that would indicate safety in numbers to you. But yet, if you're by yourself, your numbers would not encourage safety. So that's a pretty harsh reality. But fact of the matter, the caricature of myself is how people sometimes show up, and very much it's just like flipping a switch. They're the same body person, but the behaviors are hollow and it's exaggerated. It is hyperbolic. It is like me. Because if you don't like me, that means it feels like my ego is dying. And the ego doesn't exist, but fact of the matter is even Carl Jung, stated that some of the darker behaviors in humankind, those things that we try to bring from the unconscious to the conscious, are the things that are allowing the ego to drive in its desperate attempt to make itself survive. And we try to protect it. And our self-image, our ego, all those things are conceptions, they're ideas. They only exist at the subjective level. Just like they say that we don't have perfect free will, we don't. We are driven, but we do have some free will and we do make decisions. The only place we have free will is in our subjective mind, our ability to imagine. And we can exaggerate all day and you can imagine anything in your mind without limit. But in our physical reality, there are limitations. And finding the recognition of that balance can help us in healing those things that we consider that personality or those reactions that may not be so healthy for us, or those things that I'm so proud of when I show up at situations that feel uncomfortable or embarrassing to me. So that's going to bring our discussion to a close for a day, and that is quite a bit in a little bit, and I hope that you've taken something useful to help understand what it is that is personality. Not all of this was about disordered personality, but those things that shape us into being those people that we are. And what I'd like you to do is that you have any feedback for me, email me, let me know about it, tell me what you think about this episode, share this episode with other people that you think may benefit, and if you don't think that you can help them with it, send it to them anyway. Tell them Armando said. That is cool. I'd love for you to share this. And this podcast is available on all platforms that your podcasts are found, and also on YouTube. I have a few videos there from former lectures, and please like, subscribe, and share. And continue to think about things. And I would love to hear from you. I love talking to y'all folks. I'm going to continue doing this podcast because it seems to be having good effect. I appreciate your listenership, and you take care. Walk well.